Okay, what are the rules? I don't know what the rules are. But what we've been doing, we're finding the rules as we go. And so this is a conversation that is being recorded. But if you would like to ask a question without recording, just let me know, and I will pause the report. I will pause the recording, and so we can have the conversation without it being recorded, at least by me. And it's just basically on an honor system that nobody else is going to record something that the group is asked not to record. That doesn't mean you can't take notes or anything like that. But the and so what the MC, in this case today, Cassidy, is going to do is she's going to be in charge of queuing up the questions for me. So we have some questions that have been queued up in the text chat, the room, or whatever these things are called in Discord, the hashtag that says questions for PVK. And then in the past, we've sort of alternated between those and questions live from the room. And I think that's kind of a good practice because that will give someone a chance to follow up on my question, especially the question asker if they're not here. Some people have taken to preloading their question into the room before the session, which is absolutely fine. So because they might not be able to make this time, and I did one session in the afternoon so that folks in Australia and the Philippines and other places could participate, and I really should do that again. So question and answers are sort of like Stump the Chump, as the car talk guys used to say. And it's a little scarier than Stump the Chump because you get to ask your question live, and I don't know what you'll ask. So, but I do have the power of recording or not recording. And I do have the power of posting and not posting. We're not doing a live stream, so it's a little easier that way. So yeah, Cassidy, just take the questions both in the chat room and then what follows. And I know that's a little bit more work for you because you have to kind of keep them in order. There are two separate rooms. There's the hashtag convo recording chat, and I'd say use that for the normal sort of text chat back and forth. Your snide comments and your crosstalk, your passing notes basically, and then try to save the questions for PVK for the questions, and that way it makes Cassidy's life a little bit easier that she doesn't have to try to monitor not only the audible stream but also two other streams. So I'd say as we've been doing this now, this is our fourth or fifth time doing this. I did one over at the Vervaeke channel, and I learned a lot from that. So that's kind of what we're doing. And I would also the opportunity for this, as opposed to the question and answer sessions that Peterson would do, and then Jonathan Peugeot would do from Patreon, and then John Vervaeke has been doing, is if you're in the room, you get to illuminate, elucidate, map it out a little bit more so it can eke a little bit more towards the conversational thing. Whereas if there's just two sentences or a paragraph of question, I'm kind of shooting in the dark. So this way we can maybe get a little higher resolution, get a little bit more calibrated and precise on exactly what you want to talk about. And I'll just say that for me, I have appreciated these sessions because getting good feedback is really hard, and I find the Discord in general and these sessions in particular as being really helpful in terms of getting good feedback. So that's what we're doing. Those are the rules, at least the rules for now, and we'll keep seeing what goes on. So any questions for that before we dive into the written questions?
David's asking for you to unmute him, please.
Okay. All right. He is now no longer server muted. I see. When I say mute, that's just... See, I'm learning the Discord as well. So, okay. He is not... I don't see him as muted, so David, you might want to mute yourself to avoid extraneous noise into the channel and the recording. But that's
good with it now.
Okay. All right. So any other questions about format going forward or any other feedback? You've noticed I've been posting these on my channel. I don't see them as particularly popular, but I do see it as a way of trying to keep the disparate communities together, because there's some of you on the Discord, some who kind of stick to the YouTube comments. Most don't participate in either, but that's kind of the way this thing goes.
Maybe a little shorter introductions.
There's nothing short about my channel. It's if you guys find something important, you go ahead and edit and put out sound bites. I'm totally okay with that. All right, Cassidy, go ahead.
All right, so the first question is from Andrew L. And it says, what are your thoughts on Jung? I've been reading a bit of his work. I see how some of what he is saying is pointing to something like a pseudo-Gnosticism. Although I'd like to also know specifically about your thoughts on his thoughts on individualism and getting to ourself through his psychoanalytic process. And also, how does that relate to Christianity for you, especially since he focuses on how the group will tear us down?
Wow. So, let me first say that I consider myself knowing very little about Jung. I have read one of his books. I have dabbled in other books about him. I've obviously listened to Peterson and other Jungians out there, content on YouTube, but I very much consider myself unschooled and quite ignorant about Jung. Jung, right away when I started paying attention to Jordan Peterson, became kind of an issue for me because Jung had a very bad reputation in terms with Christians. A reputation as someone who dabbled in the occult, someone who was dangerous. So the very low resolution, dangerous vibe around Jung for Christians. And so I had to learn a few things. And so one of the ways I decided I wanted to take a look at him was to read this book, which is in some ways an autobiography of him. And I found the book fascinating. And I actually had a conversation, brief interchange with a fairly prominent Christian Reformed scholar about this who had also read the book. And he said, I found the book both fascinating and terrifying. And I didn't find it terrifying, but I did find it fascinating. And so let me say some of what I think Jung's, a number of things Jung has really, some of the things I really like about Jung, I think he, and the aspect of Peterson that was helpful for me that he got from Jung was a greater understanding that the mythology around me and the religion inside of me are deeply tied to what we would call my mental health. And for me, that helped understand what a pastor does. Now, so much of theological history and Protestantism over the last couple of centuries has been trying to understand two separate maps. One has been the map of theological maps that we have inherited from the past, and the new mappings that we have from the scientific frame. And I think Jung has really made some helpful contributions for me in beginning to stitch those two maps together. And for me, that was really a lot of what Peterson, why I found Peterson so helpful, because he was helping me stitch those two maps together. And again, C.S. Lewis was doing the same thing for me, but C.S. Lewis, by virtue of crowdsourcing reputation, C.S. Lewis felt safe. Jung felt hazardous. So there's kind of an initial take on Jung, and so people have like Skip Conover, like the Boyos, who have been making content for Jung. I found them helpful because they have just sort of been able to inform me more about what Jung said and help me appreciate, okay, Jung was really in dialogue with Nietzsche. Nietzsche sort of throws away, Nietzsche sort of throws a lot of things away, and Jung kind of interprets Nietzsche. And so that is helpful. And again, a lot of this stuff to me comes through Peterson. So a bunch of the rest of your question about Jung, I don't feel capable of answering. But there are in terms of Jung's life, there are some real cautionary notes in his life that I think people need to pay attention to. He did not live a model Christian life. His father was a Reformed pastor who was a deeply unhappy man who wasn't doing well. And I think part of why Jung's life took the shape as it did was the dislocation that has been happening in the church, which Protestantism both expressed and in some cases exasperated. I suspect part of Jung's father's unhappiness, which his son suffered from, went into Jung trying to sort out what he was trying to sort out. Ancient and medieval Christianity, as C.S. Lewis noted, formed an image that was coherent, cohesive, powerful. It was a meaning engine that afforded Europeans and the members of Christendom all around the world a significant amount of meaning that helped them cope with the sufferings that they had to endure. It also set up the scientific revolution, but as Peterson often says of Nietzsche, in that sense, Christianity cut its own throat. And the great insights and knowledge that the scientific revolution and its tools brought to the Christian community destroyed the discarded image. And at the end of C.S. Lewis's book, The Discarded Image, he laments the loss of the discarded image. And he says it had to go because it was proven wrong in many ways, but we miss it. And I think in many ways this is the heart of the meaning crisis. Now, at one point I decided I have a pretty extensive C.S. Lewis library in my Logos Bible software that affords me a lot of search across books. And so I searched Jung in C.S. Lewis's letters. And Lewis was aware of Jung, but there wasn't too much antagonistic or pejorative about it that I could find. So C.S. Lewis has in many ways, I've tried to use him as a guide to to walk me through this journey, just as Lewis had a guide to walk him through hell. Not that I'm saying this is hell. So there are some thoughts on Jung, and I don't necessarily feel capable of answering the more specific aspects of it. So if there's a follow-up question for that, that would be fine.
No, thank you. That was good.
All right, great. Is there any questions that we have live from this chat that someone wants to bring up? Okay, then I'll just go back to the written questions. So this next one's going to be from Jacob. If you could actually have one rule that would be enforced with real, in quotes, church discipline with teeth, so that it really did have more effect than making someone leave the church, what would it be?
Love one another. And the contents of the question are important because, as I mentioned in previous questions and answers, churches have become these voluntary organizations that have made it very interesting, that made it very easy to come and go out of. Now, that the ease with which people enter and leave the church is a testimony to the weakness of the church. And in some cases, the irony of the seeker-sensitive movement, the seeker church movement, which wanted to make churches easy to get into, also meant that churches were easy to leave. And so a rule which would be enforced, and the enforcement is a very interesting thing too, because if you would ask a parent how they enforce rules in their household, and if you sit and consider the households you grew up in and what wasn't enforced and what enforcement looked like, household rules and enforcement are basically are shaped in early childhood, and are and all of us will know that sometimes the greatest enforcement is no more than a glance, a word, or even just the imagination of a glance or a word of disappointment from a loving parent. And so in our context, we like to think of enforcement as dramatic, but in my years of pastoring, I think it's, when best done, it's much more like what happens in a healthy family, that someone in the house understands that they have now just violated something deep in the house. Now, this gets very complicated because part of the dismantling of enforcement has come as a reaction to tyranny. And so a lot of this developed in the whole gay conversation, the whole language about, coming out of the closet, that here, the person who comes out to their parents and lets them know that they're gay, that entire meme or narrative has power and derives it from the assumption that the parents are tyrannical. And when parents are tyrannical, it's valid. But in many cases, if parents are not tyrannical, and let's say someone comes out as something which violates the family norm or tradition, many parents will say things like, "I still love you. I will always love you." But the the violation or the break in the family unit or the rupture of shalom wounds the family in a way that may be expressed externally in ways that impartial observers could perceive. But the nature of the community of a family or a church is something, to dare to use this fudgy word, spiritual, that is expressed in the material, but is known by us often simply in the spiritual realm. So if there's a rule, the great rule of the church is love one another. But love is a many splendid and tortured thing. So.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions from the live chat?
This question, Augustine, just above Jacob's question. I don't know if you saw that one, Cassidy.
I did see that. I promised Dave that I would ask because I didn't see those at first, and then I promised Dave that I would ask Jacob's question next, and then I'm going to that, and then I will go back to the
Perfect.
main. Sorry.
I should trust you. I should trust my moderator.
I'm learning. I'm trying my best.
You're doing well.
So, what about theological or propositional enforcement? Asking for a friend.
That's a good question. Because, so, one of the ways to understand the Protestant Reformation is the heightening of confessional boundaries on the church. It's an amazing thing to me as a Protestant, the way Catholics do unity. Because you read enough Catholic theologians, nuns, and sometimes you read things and say, wow, that's outright heresy. That how on earth can the Roman Catholic Church allow that? Now let's pause and note that the Roman Catholic Church in the medieval period routinely killed people for propositional and theological error. And one of the things that the Protestant Reformation did was break the Roman Catholic Church of that. Now, early on in the Protestant period, Protestant churches figured out mechanisms for propositional and theological enforcement. But you'll notice that this is part and parcel of eventually these churches becoming voluntary organizations. So now there's this story I heard from my uncle of a family member who the daughter in the household became pregnant out of wedlock. They were members of a Christian Reformed church, and in that day, Christian Reformed churches were very diligent about house visitation. At least once a year, maybe once a quarter, house visitation, and very diligent about church discipline. If you started missing church without a valid reason, and a valid reason might be health, it probably not work, but health, because if you're working on Sunday, unless you're a nurse or a law enforcement or something, again, according to a lot of these implicit rules, forget about it. And because she was pregnant, they stopped attending church. And then sure enough, the elders showed up at the door, and the first word out of the mother's house was, we've joined the Reformed Church of America, because the Reformed Church of America didn't practice church discipline like the Christian Reformed Church did. And that was one of the dividing lines between the two churches. But the Reformed Church of America is one of the oldest denominations on the continent, brought over from Europe. So they had already imbibed a lot of this voluntarism of American ecclesiology. So the Christian Reformed Church has been a denomination which traditionally, and this has broken down and as the church has become more American, has enforced theological and propositional notions. Just recently, Calvin College put out 2 professors for a paper that they had written on Irenaeus about, that because the college felt violated some aspects of the Heidelberg Catechism. Now, there might have been other reasons for doing this, and in many cases, people usually, when the discipline hammer does come down, it's usually not only for the theological or propositional enforcement. And so this is an area that churches are continuing to work out. And it always happens in the midst of a far broader social context, because again, all the cues can only be interpreted also through the cultural filters. So in Protestant confessional churches, it makes sense to, here's someone that has violated their confessional commitments and they are subject to discipline. But that hardly ever happens. And so part of what I've been asking for in the Christian Reformed Church has been confessional conversations, and I've used conversation rather than confessional enforcement. And the response I got I was quite surprised at the response from the left, and I shouldn't have been as I thought about it later. The response from the left in the CRC was, oh no, we don't want to do that, because they only understood confessional conversations as a means towards enforcement. And the question that the left wanted to avoid was whether or not the debate over same-sex practice has confessional status or not, because in the women in office conversation, the Christian Reformed Church sort of came to consensus that the Heidelberg Catechism, the Canons of Dort, the Belgic Confession, the Apostles' Nicene and Athanasian creeds do not address women serving in office. Therefore, the church has freedom around it. So I think matters of theological and propositional enforcement will always be with us, because propositional is such a handy aspect of knowledge that it will always be with us. But I think there's a deep connection between modernity and the propositional, because the propositional very much invites the view from nowhere, or what I call the monarchical vision. Propositional statements are used as if they are floating out there in space, untethered from the participatory or the perspectival. So yeah, these are issues that we will continue to use, but they will be dealt with differently than, let's say, in a Roman Catholic context, where, for example, when John Kerry was running for president as a Roman Catholic, there were priests who were saying they would not serve John Kerry communion. Right there, okay, so what about abortion? What about contraception? And so these issues are also swirling around in the Roman Catholic Church, but they're dealing with it in different ways.
Okay, so the next question is from Augustine. What are the entry requirements to being a Christian? There are many people who appreciate the stories, traditions, philosophy, symbolism, and allegory of the Bible, and may even go to church regularly, but who lack propositional belief in elements like Noah's flood, the virgin birth, and Christ's bodily resurrection. Are these people Christians? What thresholds distinguish a Christian from a non-Christian? framed differently, computer software usually lists minimum system requirements to operate properly. What are the minimum system requirements for being Christian? I suspect different denominations would answer this question differently.
Oh, yes, they would. Well, let's look at the category. Okay, what is a Christian? Churches swirl around these questions all the time, and they seek out relevance realization. They seek out that relevance realization moment that could discern and distill the essence of the category. One, and because it's so difficult, we can look at a variety of ways into it. And I think in some ways these line up with Vervaeke's 4 Ps. One definition of a Christian we might find in Jesus' statements, did we not heal the sick and raise the dead? And Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you. At a deep level, finally, in the Christian context, God gets to decide. And so all of our going about the definition, it's up to him. So, and how is that expressed, and what does that mean, and what are the ramifications of it? Well, again, I see that with many of Jesus' parables talk about this. But what frustrates people about it, and why we continue to go back to the question of essence of Christianity, is, well, I'm hoping this afternoon to have time to make a video, which I would release Monday, on the question of revelation. And a bunch of these questions cohere in the same way. And so, as a Calvinist, it's very easy to say a Christian is one who God accepts. Now, obviously, Jews or Muslims or other religious groups would complain about that, but I'm a Christian, and so I'm seeing this as a Christian God. If you wanted to take it outside of a sectarian or religious tradition framework, you could say Christians are those who finally are ultimately blessed, happy, or live forever. And you can use those to map onto Christian theology in its own ways. Now, how do you become one? Well, again, there's a likely apocryphal story of a young man who came to St. Augustine and said, I'm afraid I'm not elect. And the answer that Augustine, at least in this likely apocryphal story, is, well, then go to a church and get yourself elect. Well, that sounds terribly un-Calvinist or non-Augustinian. And this leads to one of my favorite definitions of a Christian. A Christian is someone who trusts in Jesus more than they trust in themselves. And the reason I say that takes the answer out of the propositional and puts it in the participatory and the perspectival, because trust is such a foundational element for human consciousness and human experience. And so why, George Floyd was reported to have, I've never watched that video through, I don't want to. Why did George Floyd reportedly call for his mother? That's something that, is not uncommon in battlefields. Or why do we, even in our language games, so in pain, cry out, "Oh God"? What is with us? We're looking for someone bigger than ourselves to rescue us. And we usually only come to that point when we are forced to admit that we are lousy self-rescuers. And so a Christian is someone who looks to Jesus to rescue them. Now, how do you start down that road? Oh, gosh. What thresholds? Minimum system requirements. See, and this is why, again, I remain the kind of strange Calvinist that many people say I'm not really a Calvinist, or I'm not a good Calvinist, or I'm a better Calvinist than they think other Calvinists are. I think that line finally is on God's side more than mine. And so I can't I see, but even this question drills down, because the Bible has these amazing stories of, people who come to Jesus, and we expect Jesus to be like the church, a quivering mass of availability, and someone comes to Jesus and says, "My child is sick," and Jesus kind of says, "So?" And such a person today would be declared an enemy of the right side of history. Why would Jesus respond to someone like that? Jesus, I want to follow you, but first I have to be faithful to my elderly parents. And Jesus says, "Let the dead bury their own dead. You follow me." Oh my goodness. Jesus is notorious for this kind of thing. And then he's hanging on the cross, and one gospel says both of the brigands on either side heap insults at him, and then in Luke, one of the brigands starts sticking up for Jesus and expresses some talk about gallows, talk about deathbed repentance. The dude is on the cross, he's dying, and Jesus says, "Surely you'll be with me in paradise," to this guy. So what are the minimum requirements? So on one hand, Jesus says, unless you deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me, you can have no part of me. And Jesus says all of these earthly manifestations that we would imagine to be absolutely essential expressions of the genuine article, healing the sick and raising the dead and aligning with Jesus. Jesus says, "Depart from me, I never knew you." And another guy who's on the cross, Jesus says, "Surely you'll be with me in paradise." You can either say Jesus is wildly inconsistent or chaotic, or Jesus continues to invite us into drilling down into the mysteries of what redemption means. And so to anyone that is anxious for their standing with respect to Jesus, I would say something similar to what my father would often tell me: the anxiety itself is likely a good sign. And the advice I would offer them is flee to Jesus. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, talk to him. I don't know how to talk to him. Well, he gave you some words. They're called the Lord's Prayer. Start with those. And start investigating him. Read books about him. Go to a church. Hopefully, churches remain places where you can find out about Jesus. And yeah, there's a lot of other stuff going on, and you're going to have to weed through that, but that's normal for human beings. So now the questions about the virgin birth, questions about the resurrection, questions about all of these questions, they're all going to come. And okay, they're just going to come. Make your peace with them. Pursue them. Be honest with yourself about how you feel with them. Unless you're honest with yourself, you're not really going to be able to pursue them in integrity. And this gets into the whole question of conversations in good faith. So pursue them in good faith. Be honest with them. And, part of what I want to model in my online project is, John Vervaeke and I, he's a non-theist, I'm a theist. I've never asked him this question about the resurrection, but I suspect John Vervaeke would say, I believe Jesus Christ was a historical person. I believe we can learn some things about him through these gospel records, but they are, and John would have his own telling imagination of what the gospel records would be, And if I would say, do you think that Jesus was crucified? He would probably say yes. That's almost the least doubtable element of the historical record we see through secularity about Jesus. Do you think he rose from the dead? Do you think the disciples touched his hands and put their hands in his side? I would suspect John Vervaeke would say, I don't know. Okay? Me, I think, yeah, I think those stories are true. I think it really happened. Now, are there lots of Christians with lots of questions about the resurrection? Yeah. Do I think when they die and come face to face with Jesus, Jesus is going to say, well, part of me thinks Jesus will say, how do you like me now? Do you think I'm alive? I mean, that's what he did to the Apostle Paul. So, Andrea, your mic is live. You might want to mute that.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry, Paul.
That's okay. That's okay. I don't want to use the server mute because that really shuts you up. But, so if you are asking this question for yourself, bank on God's generosity and mercy and believe that if, in fact, he is calling you to himself, even your path away from him will be used by him for God's glory and for the betterment of this life and the age to come. And the reason I say that is because I've thought about the question of why on earth do we meet Paul holding the cloak of Stephen's executors, giving agreement to that, and find Paul hunting down the church. And when Paul is participating in Stephen's execution, in the words there of the book of Acts, the heavens open and Stephen has this vision, and Stephen in the book of Acts is the most Christ-like apostle, even though he's not one of the 12. And it's like, hey, Jesus, wouldn't it have been easy at that moment to show yourself to Paul? Why do you wait for him to persecute the church? And then he's on the road to Damascus, and then he shows up, and then he blinds Paul. And I think that is, go to Jonathan Peugeot with that question, because it's deeply symbolic. And then the Holy Spirit goes to Ananias and says, go find Paul. He's on Straight Street and pray for him. And Ananias is like, I don't want to do this. And you look at the story, and part of you just has to say, what is God doing to these poor people? And in our modern coddled age, we would imagine a good God wouldn't ask poor Ananias to go and pray for Paul. A good God would have stopped Paul at the stoning of Stephen. A good God would have turned all the stones hurled at Stephen into cotton balls. Well, if you're going to get any message from the Bible, it's that, as C.S. Lewis noted, God is more like a real lion. And he's not afraid to play rough. And we might not like that, but if rough and tumble play is good for little boys, I would imagine that the rough and tumble play that God puts us through now is good for us when we finally grow up in the age to come. So, again, my answers are too long, and I hope that answers your question. It's a great question. So I'm glad to have at least had a chance to take a shot at it and the time to ramble a bit.
All right, do we have a voice question?
Question, if no one minds. Hey, Paul, it's Mercury.
Hey, Merc.
Speaking to Dr. Greg Enriquez today, and me and him are talking about setting up a circling session with Guy. I wanted to pull you in on it. So my question is, what do you think of Dr. Greg's tree of knowledge idea? What do you think of Guy Sengstock circling? and because I would rather have a sane person on the side of God as part of this circling to balance me out. Would you be willing to join us for a session?
Oh, I don't even know who Greg Enriquez is, and I've been a little curious about guys circling, but I've never participated in one, and I've never seen one, and so I'm, in the past, obviously I give hot takes on things, probably way too much than I should, and I've said things I regret, so I don't want to say anything ill about his method, but I don't really know much about it, so I don't know. I'm curious about it, and so I'd probably like to at some point. I'm working on a chapter for a book that Vervaeke and team are putting together, and so that's kind of, I've got a deadline looming on me, and so that's kind of bound up my time for the next couple of weeks. But I'd be curious at one point to do one, and maybe at some point I guess I'd like to do one with Guy. The one thing I have kind of picked up about it is that it's a practice of sort of radical acceptance that yields a palpable sense of intimacy. That those aren't, churches have ways of doing similar things. But with that kind of power, I'm always a little bit, I'm quite respectful of that kind of power, because when people get intimate with strangers quickly and there aren't guardrails around, things can get weird and sometimes dangerous. So that's the hesitation I have about it. But I'm still very curious, so I can't do one for a couple of weeks. At some point, I'd probably like to do one with if you're gonna get a chance to do one with the originator of it, I'd love to do one with Guy. But so that's my hot take.
To you then about the future, because that wasn't something necessarily immediate, but yeah, you feel like with Guy's method, it's really about a deep conversation and listening. And Dr. Gregg's, sort of part of the overall thing that John Vervaeke's doing as well. I imagine you would find his work interesting.
Okay, well, I'll look more into it. So, but I'm obviously all about deep conversation.
Okay, so we'll get back to you at some point in the future about that then.
Okay.
Okay, great. The next question is from Dave W., and it's a question inspired by Job. I read James Fowler's book, Stages of Faith, some years ago and found it fascinating. I remember you said in one of your videos that you had read it as well, and I believe you said that you thought its analysis was too convenient. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this. Do you have any other thoughts on Fowler's theory?
I have similar prejudices, let's call them. That's maybe the best word to call them. Fowler is a pretty common text that a lot of seminarians ask people to read. And I thought C.S. Lewis has this quip about sometimes if a shoe fits too well, we should suspect it. And I look at that with Fowler's theory. Let me give an illustration. I know many people in the church that Fowler's theory in some ways is an application of developmental psychology with respect to stages of human development. Now, on one point, a developmental narrative like that is a chronological narrative, in that if you meet someone who has I don't have Fowler in front of me, who has achieved what Fowler imagines to be the pinnacle of what faith is, they will likely have passed through and understand to a degree the other stages. The narrative itself sets up, in some ways, an implicit hierarchy which says that, or which suggests, it might not even say it, which suggests that in the eyes of God, the person who receives this highest stage is in some way, to use common language, a better Christian than one in the previous stage. Now, where I've seen this practiced is in churches, usually in churches full of people with very high IQ scores, who have read a lot of books, who have sort of adopted who are very high in openness, and who have sort of adopted a very, let's say, cosmopolitan, pluralistic approach to spirituality. Okay, fair enough. Then I meet Christians who, in Fowler's stages, would be towards the bottom. These are people who only see black and white, and they have rigid rules about what God permits and what God doesn't permit. And I have often seen people in those other churches of high intelligent, very successful, let's call these people privileged. Privileged Christians looking down their noses at these other Christians who have legalisms in black and white categories, and who the Bible says it, I believe it, that settles it. They're fundamentalists, they're dogmatists, they're all of these things. They're rigid, they're unaccepting. Well, and that's just where I often pause, because I have often noted the capacity of some of these supposedly low-level, dogmatic, black and white Christians. I've seen their capacity to actually love in real time and real space, with real casseroles and real money and real car rides, that have far outshone those supposedly higher reaches of the faith. And when I see that, I say, well, Fowler is recognizing something here, and it may very well have a lot to say about development, and it may very well have a lot to say about intelligence, and it may well have a lot to say about education and culture. But the implicit assumption of a book like this is, Jesus sure does love the theological professor and the erudite church that he attends. And I look at Jesus and say, I'm a little skeptical. I look at it more as gifts of the Spirit, that hands can do things that noses can't do, and noses can do things that hands can't do. And I see Fowler, in some ways, as setting up a nice little hierarchy where the kind of people who write books and the kind of people who can think complicated thoughts and see lots of nuance and want to practice a certain kinds of tolerance and non-judgmentalism congratulate their tribe. But here's the crazy thing about Jesus. Jesus can both excel in the areas of deep learning and sometimes expresses the antithetical of the imagined lower stages of faith. And so that's why when I have similar feelings about the integral spiral. You know, so John Vervaeke and Rafe Kelly talked about that a little bit, and I'm not surprised that I think there are a lot of really key insights in terms of the integral people and what they're noticing, and that, yeah, you don't leave the stages behind, and you do. But in many of these hierarchies, I just so often find them conveniently biased towards the people who are writing them. I mean, there's a certain degree of self-righteousness to write a book in which the book can end no other way than that the author of the book has, maybe with certain a degree of self-deprecation, achieved the upper registers of the pecking order that they have just illuminated for 200 or 300 pages. When I smell that kind of thing, I think, that's one of these human tricks that we do. Finally, Lord, as the Pharisee who went up to the temple to pray, I thank you that I am not like those low register Christians who believe in black and white and are fundamentalist and don't see shades of gray and won't go to restaurants on Sundays, or are upset that that the sexual revolution is remaking their landscape. I dare bet that we can learn from each other. And so then, what to me is the hierarchy? Well, that goes back to my first question. I think Jesus sets the hierarchy. The hierarchy is love. And I've seen people with low intelligence, with no education. I've seen them love well. And people with all of this knowledge in the world and all of this urbane, pluralistic sensitivity, I don't give a toot for the quality of the love that they show, at least the love I can see. So there's my longer answer to Job's question.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions from the voice channel? All right, I will move on to another written one. So a question from Gomerday, if I'm pronouncing that right. It starts with a quote from a sermon he saw on Father's Day. The quote is, "So all of you who say that fathers don't matter, you need to change your philosophy on that, because fathers are very important, particularly for boys, because boys need something to reflect off on, to figure out what am I supposed to be when I get here, there, or elsewhere. That's very important to understand that. Now, I know that your child's father might not have been a good husband, but that doesn't always mean that he can't be a good father. Just like your being a good mother doesn't always make you a good wife." So his next text is, "My friend disagreed with this pastor saying that bad father is bad husband. It's not separate. And this type of thinking will cause so much damage to the body of Christ. So my question to you, Pastor Paul, is there a nuanced way to see the bad father equals bad husband? Should there be an argument that bad fathers equals bad husband isn't always the case? Or this is where we as individuals just have to draw a hard line. There are no alternative views on this matter."
I'm one of those urbane people I just called out. If bad father equals bad husband, why do we have two words? Human beings are so complex, so nuanced. I've seen, and even to get something as low resolution as the word bad, and this again is where we get into these questions of binary versus analog, or bounded set values versus center set values. Bad is binary. It's on or off, good, bad. How bad, what bad, in what way, so on and so forth. There have been many wives who are disappointed in their husbands as husbands, but keep them around because they're showing value as fathers, and vice versa. Now, there are a lot of people who are bad at both because there is a reason they're bad at both. And it might be maybe there's an addiction, maybe there's a lack of character, maybe there's a bad, maybe they had bad parenting. You know, there's lots of ways. And the fact that someone would make that connection likely indicates that, yeah, often it's the case that if someone is a bad husband, they're a bad father. And often it's the case that if someone is a bad father, they're probably a bad husband. And there's likely a reason that they're not doing well on either, because both fatherhood and husbanding are relational skills and categories. But I like what you had to say in response to this, that fathering is critically important. And I forget the guy's name right now, but he's written some books on fathering. And his story was he was during the 60s and 70s women's liberation movement. He was heralded into the National Organization of Women. But then they all turned on him when he said, hey, fatherhood is vitally important. And this, again, is a, what, we can't manage two ideas at the same time? Come on, we can. Let's do better. So I don't think that anybody's, when I try to evaluate myself as a husband and a father, I'd give myself very different scores, but both husbanding and fathering are tremendously complex things in themselves. Just sit down with a real wife and talk to her about her husband. And in many cases, if she's still with him, you'll hear her say, he does these things well, and I value that. He doesn't do these things well, and I wish he'd do them better. Think about your own father. Now, the guy might have been a terrible person, but it is not uncommon for me to have a conversation with someone whose parents, go look at my conversation with Guy Sengstock when he talked about his parents. He was kind of raised by his grandfather. Even how many conversations with men haven't I had on their channel that for one reason or another they had disappointments with their fathers. But yet years later, they might come around and say, but you know what? I got this from my father, and I was blessed by it. And I think about my father. My father was by no means a terribly attentive father. My father, like me, was very non-directional. My father didn't sit down and teach me things. My father didn't throw a ball with me. My father didn't throw a ball well. My father had many flaws and shortcomings and defects. But it's interesting to me that now in my 50s, after my father has been dead for 7 years now, my appreciation for what he did give me grows. So when someone comes up with a rule like bad father equals bad husband, they're speaking out of some pain. They're working on some stuff. And, you don't have to beat their head down and don't say that. They're just listen, because they're working on some stuff. Probably 5 or 10 years, they might understand that fatherhood is different from husbanding. So there's my answer.
Great. And then Alexander G. just said that the author who had written about fathering and boys is Warren Farrell. Was that who you were referring to, Paul?
That's him. Yep.
Okay, great. So we have another chance for a voice question. If anyone
I got one.
Okay, great.
It's one that came up in a conversation last night. So there's a young woman in my town, and she always wants to know how the faith's going. So you end up in strange conversations about metaphysics and morality. So at some point, she said, so we were talking about truth, and like if somebody held a gun to your head, would you say whether you believed in God or not? I said, well, that's complex. Like, I need to have more context. Like, are there 5 more people whose lives depends on what I answer? Like, is this some sort of trolley problem? So, but to her, it's like, well, you should say, yes, you should speak the truth because God will sort the rest out. Like, yeah, but, what if I have a responsibility to these other people? So basically, I was trying to figure out where does the love God with all your heart and all your mind and whatever. How does that stack in the divine calculus towards loving your enemy and loving your fellow man? So I was kind of thinking about that. Like, what's the proper approach there if you are actually a believer?
So you're asking me the question?
Or anyone else, but you're a pastor.
I think your ponderings on that question are excellent, Job. I think you're barking up the right tree, and I think even the illustration of itself, gun to the head moments. And actually, if someone would ask me that question in a less contextualized situation, I would probably ask them, why do you want to know? What are you trying to get at? And I think in a lot of times they're trying to get at this question of, okay, this age or the next. How do we try to evaluate those ages? Do we prioritize things now? In other words, if I'm walking to church, should I give, and I have $10 in my pocket that I am going to give to the church, and I only have a $10 bill, to have a less dramatic question, and I see a beggar on the street, do I give the beggar my $10, or do I go into church and give my $10? In some ways, it's a similar question, because, well, which is it? But there's lots more questions underneath that question, too, in terms of, so someone puts a gun to your head and says, do you believe in God or not? And right away, anybody with a gun to the head the first thing they will think about will not only be, do I believe in God or not? Is going to be, what question gets the person to not pull the trigger? That's really the question. And that's why torture doesn't work, because the point of torture is, how do I make the pain stop? So the truth is, we declare our belief or unbelief in God. You're going to have to spell that whole thing out every day without guns to our head. So there's a lot of interesting questions with the gun to the head question that that you might say, well, which of these questions would you like answered? Now, you being a Hollander, know, maybe you don't know, I don't know, because so in the Christian Reformed Church, a lot of Dutch immigrants left the Netherlands after the Second World War. A lot of what happened in the Netherlands during the Second World War was the question, Dutchmen, of course, Jews lived in the Netherlands. So that's where my great-grandfather was a Jew living in the Netherlands. And when World War II was going on, even though our Jewish roots were covered up, my grandfather said to my father at one point during the war, you know, if we were still living in the Netherlands, we'd likely be going to those death camps. Well, there's a sobering thought. And then when I did a little genealogical work, I discovered, holy cow, a whole bunch of my distant cousins did go to Sobibor and Auschwitz and these camps. Okay, so the Dutch were watching this happening. And, you know, read The Hiding Place, Corrie Ten Boom. Oh, what a powerful book. What do we do? And so they started hiding Jews. And then, of course, the Nazis come looking for the Jews. What do you do? Now, a lot of these people had crises of conscience when they come in. Well, if you're looking for Jews, the simplest thing to do is walk in and say, are you hiding Jews? Now, here you have the irony that many of the people who were hiding Jews were very significant committed Christians who believed, thou shalt not lie. So when the Nazi comes in and then they say, are you hiding Jews? What are you going to say? And so in the Christian Reformed Church growing up, this was a staple question that was debated on childhood playgrounds. Do you say yes or no to the Nazis? Well, and this gets back to okay, now it's not, well, if you say yes, you're going to be in trouble for hiding Jews and might lose your life, like Corrie Ten Boom's sister. And the Jews will lose their life. Or do you lie and perhaps threaten your standing with God? And what does God require of you? Does God require that you say, I believe? And Jesus addresses this. Jesus says, if you're unwilling to bear witness to me in the public now, if you're ashamed of me now, I'll be ashamed of you on the day of the Lord. So, yeah. And you're exactly right, Job. Depends a lot on the context. And that's how the Christians who, like Corrie Ten Boom, who were hiding Jews, wrestled with the question. But as with many questions, almost always the best answer is, why do you want to know? What's really behind this question? What do you really want to know about this gun to the head question? And because then actually you might be able to give them, because they're going to derive the answer from the question based on your answer, but what's in your head, you might be answering a completely different question even though the words are identical.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. Of course you can fire back with, well, it depends what you mean by belief, but then they'll just shoot you even more. So that doesn't happen. So yeah, you kind of think, there's a spot in John where, the Jews say to Jesus, like, well, this is a hard teaching. Who can do all this? And you wonder if all he said was just those couple of things, like, okay, love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. And, well, that's difficult enough because it sounds easy, but you try to implement it, it's pretty hard.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to have dinner. Thanks for answering my question, Paul. Take care, everybody. Have a good weekend.
All right, Job, take care.
Bye, Job. Okay, so the next written question. What is the Christian role in political systems which govern according to the consent of the governed? And by what means do you answer that question, given the New Testament was written before the rise of representative republics?
Boy, is that a good question. Because you're exactly right. In democracy, truth is crowdsourced. And so when you watch someone like the IDW peeps, like Brett Weinstein, who is in terror over the loss of STEM, well, there's frictions with democracy there too. Because what we do in democracy is decide what's good, true, right, or wrong by the consent of the governed. And you can see why Plato wanted his philosopher kings. And so what we're seeing is that, well, in some ways, there's a division between the true and the good in democracy. And democracy, there's always that tension in any kind of human agency between the true and the good, because just recently, if you're not watching Karen and Michael's conversations, they're just glorious. Those two have developed a way of conversing that is just patient and lovely, and they did a conversation recently about the true, the good, and the beautiful, and they were riffing on another video where I don't remember who it was saying that in some ways the beautiful happens when the true and the good come together. It's a very Trinitarian image. So here we are as Christians, and we have a dog in both fights. We have a dog in the good and a dog in the true, and we believe that goodness and truth comes together in the beauty of Christ. We are participating in democracies. Now, hopefully, and this is where, the implicit message, and it's not often made explicit enough. Jordan Peterson did a good job of making it so. Free speech and democracy are intimately connected, because if people are afraid to speak the truth as they see it, even if you believe that truth is wrong, democracy cannot function. It is essential for democracy. But, as I just said, there's a tension in democracy between the truth as that comes up through the voice of the people, and what is really true. And so science gets at that, because science has a monarchical vision type truth. That's what they aspire to. So it's in fact segmented and walled off from the opinions of the people. And that's why we have all these conversations about fact versus opinion and all of that. All of that training is part of the project of modernity. So Christians have a role in democracy, just like everyone else's role, to speak the truth as we see it, and to vote, and to participate. And that's why it's important that Christians try to do well in this. Now, part of what democracy also requires a submission to an impartial process, which is why we have elections, and why in democracy elections are sacred. Because, again, this is more difficult than it usually seems. We have an electoral college in America, and all kinds of other things going on. So, what is Christians' role in political systems which govern according to the consent of the governed? I would say, to participate in the system as truth tellers and witnesses of the good. Now, for this reason, certain old Christian political parties have been anti-democratic, because they have noted the difference between the good and the true, and they have said truth is not finally crowdsourced. Truth is revealed to us by God. But in all fairness to democracy, churches have long practiced the crowdsourced approach to truth. And they've done so through councils, through consensus, lots of ways. And you read that in the book of Acts. It was good to the body and to the Holy Spirit. So often we try to get a sense of the Holy Spirit by listening to one another, because each of us is sinful and twisted in our own way. So democracy has a point. And so what does it mean? Given the New Testament was written at the rise of before the rise of representative republics, you will find in the New Testament ideas that both express a monarchical perspective, where truth comes from God. Rick wants us to talk about Romans 13 at this coming week's Bible study. I laughed so hard when he said that, because that actually impinges on this question, where truth comes from God. Yes. How do we know God? Through each other. So you've got both the underpinnings of democracy and the underpinnings of monarchy. I would say in some ways the Bible is more naturally monarchical, but you do find, especially in the New Testament church, you do find seeds of democracy and representative republics. Notice that, sometimes they're casting lots, which is sort of a New Testament take on a kind of divination. You don't have the Urim and Thummim, but you find the roots of democracy in Christianity as well. So I think what we do, given where we're at right now, is I think it's a good thing to participate in the democracy, just like listening to things like Romans 13. Christians participated in monarchies. So that's my answer.
Okay, great. Paul, I actually have a question for you,
Yes.
but I'd like to do it off the record.
Oh, okay. Well, let me pause the recording. We'll try our new skill.
Third brother missing in the story of Cain and Abel. You don't have to be bitter about the world. You can still wish your brother well and try to leave it.
Why is suicide bad? The Heidelberg Catechism begins with, "What is my only comfort in life and in death?" And the first words in response to that question are, "I am not my own, but I belong, body and soul, in life and in death, to my faithful Savior Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and delivered me from the tyranny of the devil." Suicide is bad because, contrary to what many in our culture believe, you do not fully belong to yourself. You belong to your maker. You say, "Well, I don't believe I had a maker." Okay, well, there are two proximate makers that you sort of belong to. What do you mean, my parents? Yep. I don't belong to them. Well, they do have claims on you. You belong to your siblings. Well, what do you mean? Well, you share a good bit of DNA and a good bit of history with them. And so your suicide will impact them. You belong to the people who love you and have taken the time in their life to know you, to care for you, to act with generosity towards you. So you belong to them too. You belong to your children. You belong to your neighbor. So when suicide is theft, because your life does not only belong to you. Now, a good bit of it does. And I can appreciate the pain. And actually, when you think through ideas of capital punishment, and the state, in a democratic way, is sort of a crowdsourced, sometimes idolatrous, sometimes necessary representative for God, which is why in our system, the state has the power of the sword and the individual does not, because we belong to each other, and so you don't actually rightly have the power of the sword over yourself. And so what suicide expresses is an anthropology, is an overly individualistic anthropology that if pursued and expressed far enough, finally becomes hell. Now, what do I mean by that? Now, I'm not saying that everyone who commits suicide goes to hell. I do not believe that, and I do not talk that way, and I do not use that language, because in a similar, let's say I were to answer the question about the gun to the head, do you believe in God thing, if the question beneath that question is, on the basis of what I say out of my lips at this moment, God is going to condemn me for eternity, I think if we can recognize the nuances here, I think God, who was able to make the universe as it is, can certainly handle a question like this. So I think in some ways we see the enormous generosity of God with the thief on the cross, where Jesus affords that brigand paradise for a lifetime full of bad ideas and bad thoughts and bad actions. And in that one moment, based on that one word, Jesus says, "Surely you'll be with me in paradise." If Jesus is the image of the invisible God, and God is that generous, why would we imagine that in one crushing moment, one bad mistake, God will say, "Oh, that's it"? Now, God may do that at times, but I would imagine that that one decision or moment would finally be a defining moment, a moment that expresses the definition of one's life. And I think in many cases, especially now, as we have made suicide easier and easier with firearms in our homes, people make a momentary bad decision. And I think God can understand what goes into that far better than we can. But so I want to say that because suicide is, we all know people who have killed themselves. And it's a tragedy. But the question is, well, what's the moral valence of it? And I disagree with those who say, I should have the right to take my own life. And I say, I think thou shalt not steal is the applicable, and thou shalt not murder, but thou shalt not steal is the applicable command to deal with suicide. You are not your own. You partially belong to your loved ones. And if you take your life, you rob from them. I read a book, and not a Christian book, Stay, which you can find on Amazon, about suicide. And, many, apart from the Christian faith, come to the same realization. Suicide is finally a rather selfish thing. And you say, yeah, but they're suffering. You know what? That's what love means. Love means suffering for others. And if you're suffering and you're tempted to take your life. So Daniel this morning, many of you know Daniel, to talk about Daniel. Daniel's one of the homeless guys I have regular interactions with. A couple of days ago, he says to me, I'm depressed. I hate myself. I don't want to live anymore. I don't want to be me. And I've known Daniel for now 8 years. Or he said, no, I don't want to live anymore. I don't want to be me. I don't want to be me. I said, Daniel, so why do I feel this way? I said, Daniel, you're depressed. Yeah. Well, why am I depressed? Oh, you're depressed because you're bipolar. Yeah. And this is not news to him. And I said, Daniel, in 3 or 4 days, you're going to tell me, I haven't slept all night. And sure enough, this morning I get here and he's here and he knows he's got to pack up and leave because he's not supposed to be here. And so, oh, I'm sorry, I'm here. So, okay, Daniel. I haven't slept for like 2 nights. He was depressed 4 days ago. He hasn't slept for 2 nights. 5 days from now, I'm going to hear the depressed line again. And so I can plot him on a calendar. And when he's depressed, he's suicidal. Now, to his credit, he's never taken his life. He's never succeeded. But so when we practice not stealing our life from our God and our loved ones, we are loving them. And whether or not we recognize it, if we have friends and family who are depressed, they might be a royal pain to work with or to live with. They might be, their depression might make you suffer tremendously, because if someone in the household is depressed, everyone suffers. But they're not taking their own life might also be a very heroic thing, because they are not robbing us of their life, and they're doing it at great cost. So there's a lot to this.
Okay, do we have another voice question?
Yeah, sure. I'm very sorry for interjecting, but I just wanna make a little interjection about the suicide and the death thing. Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. The thought escapes me at the moment. Yeah, I forgot everything I wanted to say, so
Okay.
I'm just gonna leave and pretend I never was even here in the first.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry you feel that way. That's the danger of asking a question.
Yeah.
Do we have another voice question that somebody wants to ask?
I have a question. This is Joe. Along those lines, this sense that you repeat often, Paul, it says, "I am not my own." It seems like it lines up with the shift from the old Adam to the new Adam. That the old Adam, in some ways, conceives himself as a private creature, a private affair, and then the new Adam represents entering into a mode of being, or a discovery, a revelation of oneself as a mutual affair. You're both an individual thing, but on many different levels, that only makes sense within the context of a mutual.
Yeah.
So I am crowdsourced in many respects. I don't have ideas have me, that kind of stuff. My sensation on a sort of a personal level or psychological level is when I am living in and through, or at least striving life as a mutual affair, then it becomes critical with whom I am mutualizing, so to speak. And so I begin to curate, because if I'm going to trust my life with that contextualizing power, then who can I trust? But even after sifting through all the trustworthy arenas, I arrive at Christ. The idea of entrusting, the vertigo I experience from being in a relationship with Christ, or Christ has revealed through my most meaningful relationships with families and friends. There's an enormous vertigo shifting from how I think and feel and what I am in that context, and then what I am when I sort of, in the day-to-day, walk and breathe and think in the mode of the old Adam. I'm not going to be able to phrase this well, perhaps, but I'm wondering if that kind of vertigo, whereby on the one moment I have all these prejudices, and I'm quite happy with it because I take them personally in their mind, and in the next moment if I am in the spirit, so to speak, I voluntarily and gladly divest myself of those prejudices for the sake of entering into something more extraordinary.
Yeah.
But it is such a swing that it almost reminds me of what we would think of when we talk about someone entering into a cult. And I'm wondering, is Christianity in some ways hinting that we are creatures that are wonderfully suited to participating deeply in a personality cult, and the proper personality is that of Christ. But fundamentally, it involves permitting yourself to be deeply infected by a psychic technology, or whatever that word is, a modality that is basically a personality infusing you. And I'm on the one hand, I'm very happy with that. On the other hand, I'm extremely disturbed by it.
I think it's a great observation, and I think you're seeing rightly. I should have another conversation with Nick at some point. Yeah, I had a whole series of conversations with Nick early on. I nicknamed poor Nick, for cult Nick, and then I had a conversation with Mary about cults. There's to a certain degree, a cult is an intensification of certain relational dynamics. So is a romantic relationship. There are many ways in which a romantic relationship and a cult are very much alike. Just look at look how a marriage is like a cult. where you give over all of your money and you no longer see other people, and sometimes family wants to rescue you from your new obsession. Now, in time, what happens in a healthy marriage is that the cult-like aspects are not eliminated but worked through. And as I'm working on this, Rafe has this question about revelation that I want to get at. And I really like Vervaeke's ideas of reciprocal narrowing as addiction, which he gets from someone else. I don't remember that person's name. But there's also, so if there's reciprocal narrowing, isn't there also reciprocal broadening? And so the difference finally between a cult and a church, and between a healthy relationship and an unhealthy relationship, and a healthy marriage and an unhealthy marriage, is finally the way, the fruits of this product. We name things cult, who separate members from their families, take all their money, abuse them. It'll often become sexual, on and on and on, and destroy the person. And in a lot of ways, that looks a lot like addiction. That's what heroin will do to you. That's what alcohol might do to you. That's what workaholics do. That's what their jobs do to them. And so in some ways, all of these things sort of map onto each other. Whereas if everything is sort of properly arranged, things go the other way. And I'm currently going through one of these Audible Great Courses series on Orwell. And the author, he wrote a biography, the lecturer is trying to assess Orwell's, what happened as a result of Orwell's marriage to his wife. And they had both been unfaithful to each other. The marriage hadn't been particularly happy. They eventually adopted a child that kind of put things in the right direction, but then the wife dies suddenly on the operating table while Orwell is in Europe during the destruction of the Nazis. And so then the author does some assessment of this marriage, and what did this marriage finally do for Orwell. If Christ is the image of the invisible God, if Christ is the, in Jungian terms, the archetype of the ideal human being, then you will have reciprocal broadening as you get further up and further into Christ. And there will be aspects of that, of your love for him, that resonate with cultishness, but its long-term impacts will be reciprocal broadening rather than the reciprocal narrowing that we see from cults or addicts or bad marriages. I don't know if that helps at all. Now, you're still online, I can see you, so I don't know, maybe you can't answer right now, but...
I'm just driving, it's awfully noisy. But yes, thank you.
Okay. So that would be my answer.
Well, maybe just to be a joiner would be, I think it seems like the critical piece in this is that I cannot accomplish myself properly by myself, and I think that really runs counter to the ethos of the modern age.
Right. And that's why my answer to suicide is as it is.
So back to the church thing, or even the church that's not a church. Yeah, I'm a born and raised Catholic, and nonetheless have an allergic reaction to the prospect of living life in community. Because I'm also very much infected by the pop culture, I suppose. But I've discovered along the way, I can't no amount of education is going to afford me the power to become the new Adam or my best idealized self by myself. I don't seem to be able to have the wherewithal or the wits or the willpower to accomplish that, except in community. And yet community gives me the heebie-jeebies. My point is seems to be a really strong tension there, and I think you've answered my question. I was just in a sense saying, does that seem normal?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Because all of this, to enter into community is to sacrifice. To love is to sacrifice. To choose is to choose one path is to limit potential, and but it's exactly what Jesus says. If you want to save your life selfishly, you'll lose it. And if you lose your life by giving it to others, you'll find it, and you will in fact become who you could not be on your own. So anyway, we got a few other questions. Maybe I can try and be brief. See if we can just hit the written questions and see what we can do. How's that sound?
That sounds good to me. So Topher had two particularly good questions, and I don't want to pick between them, so I'll ask them both, and then you can choose which one you'd like to answer. So the first one is, what advice would you give for dealing with friends and family that are unconscious devotees of the new intersectional religion? And his second question is, which topic that we ask you about do you find your golden glimmering salience highlighter making your tongue the lightest and most animated?
Ooh, wow. They are good questions. I think you should love your family and friends who are unconscious devotees of the new intersectional religion. And that means that on one hand, you should probably be a little disturbed that they are falling victim to a certain current that is going through. And on the other hand, you should be patient and kind and gentle and wise as serpents and innocent as doves. In other words, everything we know from Jesus, everything we see from Jesus applies here. Jesus lived in a culture war that was at least as fierce as this one. And if you want to know how to navigate it, watch Jesus, because he shows us how to do it. And sometimes he can be very direct. And he, in fact, was so annoying they killed him. So bear that in mind. Other times he could be astoundingly loving and tolerant and patient and affirming. And so study Jesus carefully and be like him. And someone would say, well, Pastor Paul, you're a pastor. That's the answer you're going to give to everything. Yes, that's right. So the second question, I'll see if I can. Which topics that we ask you about do you find your golden glimmering salience highlighter making your tongue the lightest and the most animated? I like questions that give me the chance to talk about Jesus and the Bible and the gospel and the tremendously hopeful, joyful life of the age to come. Those are the most fun, because when I talk about those things, I feel God's pleasure, and my anxieties and my fears and my worries all are pushed back to the side, and I find it easier to believe and to hope that he will one day come and make all of these hard, cruel things undone. So any question that gives me a chance to talk about Jesus makes me happy. So that's why it's a good thing I'm a minister, because I get to do this.
Okay, so the
Thank
next
you.
question. The next question by Michael T. In the light of everything going on in the U.S. right now, I'd like to have your general opinion on Christian liberation theology.
My take on liberation theology is similar to my take on woke religion. I think the victims of history are often in a better position to understand the injustices that have been perpetrated against them, which are expressed through history. And so anyone who cares about groups of people who have suffered in their groupishness throughout history, it's absolutely valid to listen to the complaints of people who have suffered injustice and discrimination. That is absolutely right. And so on that side of the equation, I try to be, as best I can, all ears. Now, so that's the thing that they like to hear from me. What don't they like to hear from me? Almost all of the oppressions wrought against these people, however grouped, whether by sex or race or socioeconomic realities, almost all of those injustices, not almost all, but at least many of them, have come about by well-meaning people trying to make the world right. And just because you have been a victim of other people's injustices and oppressions does not necessarily mean you have the answer for making the world right. Because almost every oppressing group at one point was an oppressed group. And whereas it's true that sometimes the people who have been hurt by others have greater insights into the details of how we hurt one another, it is also true that hurt people hurt people. And the way out of this, again, I think we see in Jesus. That we forgive each other. That we love our enemies. And so liberation theology can give insight into the fact that when Israel had forgotten, the children of Israel had forgotten the Lord's name, he still heard their cries. And he still stepped in to liberate them. They should continue to read about the quality of the slaves' hearts, because you will find that in the desert wanderings. And so liberation theology can be a wonderful tool for understanding, but I don't have any confidence in their remedies apart from what I see in Jesus. So there's that.
Okay, and I'm just going to keep asking Paul till you say it cut off.
Yep.
So controller 796, I've explored for years now the free will question, and I've come across that Calvinists do not believe humanity has libertarian free will. I want to know how you solve the problem that comes from not having free will at all and being able to sin.
John Calvin's answers to these questions in many ways were pretty standard Roman Catholic answers. In successive decades and centuries, many people took these answers and modernized them And what we saw in that modernized, in the modernized time, after deism had really taken hold, is that the fracture between God's sovereignty and our will. And so I find it helpful to, as Tim Keller says, well, there's a compatibilism in the Bible. If Calvinism is supposed to be derived on the Bible, then the primary source and the compatibilism in the Bible ought to inform the canons of Dort. And I also benefit from talking to Brett Sockold about primary and secondary causality. This aspect of what has now become kind of the defining label of Calvinism, and I would recommend a paper that you can find on the internet of a lecture given by Richard Mueller, who taught at Calvin Seminary. Was Calvin a Calvinist? Is a helpful document in understanding this part of this historical question. So I think, as with Sam Harris, if you look through the world in one particular lens, determinism makes a lot of sense. We're all, in some ways, non-player characters, and our ideas have us. And round we go. If we look at the world through another lens, we say, well, we're all making these choices. And nobody's putting a gun to my head telling me to make videos online. And so I tend to think that this structure of the manifest image and the scientific image is sort of a helpful way in understanding some of those tensions of agency. Now, I was talking to a friend, and we were talking about this a little bit, and he used these words. He said, I think this is a black box problem, that this is one of these things that we know human beings are formed, and we have to treat human beings like they have will. So to simply define all Calvinists as determinists isn't true historically. It is true of some Calvinists. It's like saying, I don't know, all married men are tyrants. Well, you will certainly find tyrannical married men, but Calvinism is a much broader category than just questions of determinism. So that's my answer to that.
Okay, so David in Sacramento said, I have recently been awakened by Trevor Noah mentioning Rousseau and Social Contract concepts that inspired the formation of the United States Constitution and Enlightenment ideas. It is an area of foundational principles that I'm exploring now, and I'm wondering if you had some thoughts on this, or if Jordan Peterson had some thoughts on this.
Rousseau is definitely an important figure in the history of a system. So in some ways, early American history can be understood through the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. And in Jefferson, you see Rousseau. And in Adams, you have the older English voice that came through Puritanism. Rousseau was obviously a voice of liberty. And you can see within Rousseau the upsides and the downsides of that. There's a tyrannical potential within Christianity. And Puritanism is in some ways synonymous with tyranny. I tend to be more on the Reformed Calvinist Puritan side, but I'm also high in openness, which makes me sound a little Rousseauian. I was quite interested to hear Peterson doesn't have a lot good to say about Rousseau, but Peterson is sort of libertarian in some ways. So, we use these historical figures like Rousseau or Calvin because they help our conversations, because they become little shorthands for far bigger things that we want to bring into the conversation, but the way time and consciousness and conversation limits us, we can't bring it all in. And so in that sense, they're a little fudgy and they're a little sloshy. So, yeah, Rousseau belongs in the conversation, but it's a complicated matter. So I'm kind of out of time, so I'll leave it at that. Let's see, how many more questions do we have?
You had 2 more questions.
All right, let's see if we can bang them out before I go.
Okay. If we're to, this is from Matt Allison, if we are to bear our cross in this life, voluntarily suffer, then happiness is at best an appearance. What then should the sufferer strive for, internalize, or dream when the goal of sanctification cannot include a faulty notion of happiness that in this life which cannot be represented?
Happiness is not antithetical to sanctification. In fact, and I think John Piper, God is kind of riffs on Augustine. We are happiest when God is most satisfied in us. And so part of, in an Augustinian sense, of rearranging our disordered loves is that in many ways we will be most happy when our lives are in order. Now, how does that work in this broken world with our broken selves? And I think, again, we look at Jesus. Jesus could at times be filled with joy and happiness. There are times in the Gospels when Jesus sees something and the joy just comes through the text. And there are times in the Gospels when Jesus sees things and the sorrow or the frustration just come through the text. Life will be like that. And life will be like that. And so we shouldn't, happiness, and now, of course, happiness is fudgy in our own context. I was watching Inside Out, I think it's the name of it, that little Pixar movie about what's going on in the little girl's head with the little cartoon characters and such. Fun movie. I really enjoy it. But watching it again a couple nights ago, the underlying assumption of the movie is that, well, the goal is to make the little girl happy. Well, first things first, as Lewis said, don't search for happiness. Search for Christ. And in him, you'll find happiness. But joy is, and the movie gets at that to a degree, because a central crisis of the movie is that the little sad personality and the joyful personality, well, in a sense, these two are going to have to figure out, or that happy, see, they call her joy, she should be happy. That joy is really happiness plus meaning. And that almost always includes sensuch or elements of suffering in this world. So the sufferer should strive for Christ and this is Christianity. A Christian, going back to an earlier question, a Christian is a disciple of Jesus. We would imagine a Buddhist is a disciple of Buddha. A Confucian is a disciple of Confucius. A Christian is a disciple of Christ. Follow him. You will be happy sometimes, and sometimes you won't. And as Jonathan Haidt notes in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, some of that experiential happiness, I'm afraid, is a matter of how you were wired from genetics, and as every American knows, is a matter of your circumstance as well. So that's life. How to live it? Be Jesus' disciple. Okay.
Okay, so there's this last question here. There's sort of a longer, more specific question, but I'm going to ask the bottom one, and you can refer to that when you answer. Can you speak on some of the differences between guarding our hearts and being fearful?
Again, wisdom. Fear is, you need fear. There are a lot of things to be afraid of. And that's why you guard your heart. Guarding your heart is more an expression of the wisdom. Because a guard is not a door. Is not, well, let me say it this way. A guard is not a wall. Wall off your heart is not guarding your heart. A guard sees the person come into the sphere or the room or the stage and has to determine, do I let this person through or do I keep this person out? That's what it means to guard the door. A wall has no such semi-permeability. So guard your heart is exactly right. And your fears are given to you to assist you in guarding. Your fears are tools. They may not be your master. If your fear becomes your master, then, well, you've displaced Jesus with your fears. Jesus is your master. Fear is a servant. Let the guard figure out how to use it properly. I saw that last question sneak in late. What do I think of John Wesley? Oh boy. I have a fairly... I think John Wesley was a great Christian hero who has much to teach us. Now someone might say, well, he was in many ways a contra Calvinist. Well, I can't read C.S. Lewis and I can't read Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton, without hearing them make disparaging comments about Calvinists. So, if I am only going to read people who affirm the labels that I have been brought up to esteem, my reading will be very narrow indeed. So, I have deep appreciation for the Methodist movement. And in many cases, and I think this of the Protestant Reformation as well, these reform movements are also contextualized, and the ones that grow large and are finally nicely integrated into the church over time probably grew to address things that needed to be addressing, usually things that had gotten tyrannical. And again, this connects my answer with liberation theology. Liberation theology grows out of a world where people are crushed. And I think it's easy to say from Christianity, people ought to be loved, not crushed. And so, Jonathan Peugeot's excellent video on protest. Those who are being crushed should protest. And those who are doing the crushing should listen. But here's the complexity. It's very easy for those who are being crushed to get revenge. And what God says is, don't do the revenge thing. Well, why not? Because the revenge thing very quickly becomes a drug. And power is something that we all use because it's delegated from God. That's what Romans 13 means. So, John Wesley is a very interesting man who led an enormously important Christian movement that helped reform the church and helped reform the church from some of the tyrannies and excesses that the Calvinist movement brought on. Almost all of the world-saving, the participatory world-saving work we will do badly, and it will create tyrannies, and it will have to be addressed and remedied by others later on in history. And the process of that continual correction, I think, is a process led by the Holy Spirit. And so even as a Calvinist, now at this date, I can look back with appreciation for much of what John Wesley did, and certainly his brother Charles. So there's my answer. All right, I am going to cut it off there. I went 22 minutes over, but only 2 hours on the recording or so. So thank you all. I'm going to stop the recording and I want to have just 5 or 10 minutes of feedback from you about both these sessions and the value of posting them on my Facebook page. Not my Facebook page, I don't post them on the Facebook page. Posting them on my YouTube channel. So I'm going to stop the recording now, and I'd like to hear some feedback from all of you.